Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that medicine would very much like to pretend never happened. The long, embarrassing, spectacularly confident history of turning one catastrophic drug into another catastrophic drug and calling it a cure. We're talking about morphine and heroin, two substances that took turns being hailed as miracle medicines and being blamed for everything wrong with humanity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. A special, sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and you have excellent taste in historically disastrous ideas. Comments like yours genuinely shape what this channel becomes, and that means more than I can say. And if you haven't already, the channel is now live on Spotify, so you can take this particular pharmaceutical disaster wherever you go. Links in the description. Now, dim the lights, pull a blanket up, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a single plant managed to confuse the entire medical establishment for 200 years running? Did the doctors who invented heroin genuinely believe they'd solved addiction? What exactly was going through the mind of the Bayer chemist who looked at morphine, fiddled with it in a laboratory and decided the responsible next step was to sell it in cough syrup for children? Were there people in 1902 with a morphine habit who were genuinely told, "Good news, we have something better"? And did anyone, at any point, raise their hand and say, "Wait, should we maybe test this a little longer before putting it in the medicine cabinet next to the aspirin"? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1898. The Bayer Pharmaceutical Company has just announced their exciting new product, a safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine. They've named it Heroin because it makes you feel heroic. Everyone thinks this is a perfectly reasonable name for a drug they're about to give to children. Long before anyone knew what an opioid receptor was, the opium poppy was already one of the most widely used plants in human history, which is saying something, considering it was competing with wheat and linen. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bearing poppy, had been cultivated across the ancient world for at least 5,000 years. Sumerians called it the joy plant. Egyptians used it. Greeks used it. Arabian physicians wrote about it with the kind of fondness usually reserved for a beloved colleague. Nobody was particularly alarmed. It grew in fields, it eased pain, it helped people sleep, and it occasionally made poets say things they deeply regret in the morning. The problem, and there was, as you might suspect, a problem, is that for most of those 5,000 years, nobody really understood what they were dealing with. They knew it worked. They just didn't know why it worked, what it was doing to the brain, or why some people seemed to need more and more of it just to feel the same amount of nothing. The raw form of opium, the gummy amber-brown resin scraped from scored poppy seed pods, contains dozens of alkaloids, the most significant being morphine, codeine, and the bane. When ancient civilizations used opium, they were getting all of them at once, diluted, variable, and unpredictable in their effects depending on the strain of poppy, the climate it had grown in, and the skill of whoever had processed it. You might take a preparation one evening and feel pleasantly drowsy. You might take what looked like the same preparation the next evening and find the world narrowing to a single warm point. There was no standardization, no dosing guidance, no label on the side telling you this product was not recommended for people operating heavy agricultural equipment. You were essentially trusting the plant to behave itself, which plants are under no obligation to do. What the ancient world did understand, with considerable precision, was the phenomenology of opium, the felt experience of it. Egyptian medical papyri described it as a remedy to prevent excessive crying in children, which in context means it was being used to sedate infants, which in any context raises certain questions. Greek physicians knew it could stop pain, suppress coughs, slow diarrhea, and induce sleep profound enough to be difficult to distinguish from death, a quality they noted with clinical interest rather than alarm. Homer referenced it in the Odyssey, in a passage describing a drink laced with something that made men forget their sorrows, which either describes opium or describes the ancient world's most efficient bartender. Arab physicians of the Islamic Golden Age refined its use considerably. Avicenna, the 11th century polymath whose canon of medicine remained a standard medical text in Europe for 6 centuries, discussed opium in careful detail, its therapeutic applications, its appropriate doses, and the risks of excess. He was one of the earliest writers to note that opium, used over time, produced a dependence that could not be easily stopped. He described this with the same calm authority with which he described everything else. Nobody seems to have followed up on it with any particular urgency. The trade routes of the ancient and medieval world moved opium the way they moved spices and silk, as a valuable commodity, a thing worth carrying across deserts and oceans because the people at the other end would pay for it. Arab traders brought it east into China, where it would eventually combine with tobacco smoking culture in ways that produced the opium pipe, and, ultimately, the most visible and politically explosive opium epidemic of the 19th century. But for most of its early history, the poppy moved quietly through civilizations, doing its work, leaving its mark, and being regarded not as a menace, but as a gift. The reckoning was coming. It just moved at botanical pace. By the 17th century, opium had found its most socially acceptable form yet: laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, bottled neatly, and sold over the counter without so much as a raised eyebrow. Think of it as the original multivitamin, except instead of vitamins it contained roughly 10% opium, and the rest was wine or brandy, depending on who was making it. Physicians prescribed it for everything: pain, coughs, diarrhea, anxiety, teething, yes, teething, menstrual cramps, insomnia, and what was then diplomatically referred to as nervous complaints. Wealthy Victorian women kept it on the nightstand the way people today keep melatonin. Poets swore by it. Writers drank it by the tumbler. Thomas de Quincey wrote an entire confessional book about his dependence and made it sound almost glamorous, which, to be fair, is one of the more irresponsible things the Romantic era produced, and the competition for that title is fierce. The Swiss physician Paracelsus is generally credited with creating an early version of laudanum in the 16th century, and his formulation was startling in its ambition. Opium dissolved in alcohol, sometimes augmented with powdered gold, crushed pearls, and whatever else struck him as suitably powerful. Later versions were somewhat less extravagant, but no less potent. Thomas Sydenham, the 17th century English physician, sometimes called the father of English medicine, popularized a version, and wrote approvingly of opium's ability to manage pain and disease in terms that read today like a pharmaceutical company's dream press release. Among the remedies which it has pleased Almighty God to give to man to relieve his sufferings, he wrote, none is so universal and so efficacious as opium. This was not a fringe view. This was mainstream medicine. The social geography of laudanum use in the Victorian era is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you a great deal about how societies decide which drug problems to worry about. The typical laudanum user in 19th century England and America was not, statistically speaking, a criminal or a degenerate. She was a middle-class or upper-class woman, often prescribed the drug by her physician for conditions ranging from genuine pain to the more vague category of female complaints. A category that covered everything from menstrual pain to the kind of existential misery that comes from having no legal standing, no professional opportunities, and being expected to perform perfect domesticity, while your husband makes all decisions about your life. Laudanum numbed the pain of real physical conditions. It also numbed the pain of circumstances, and nobody found this alarming because the woman taking it was respectable. The product was sold in pharmacies, and the physician recommending it had a framed medical degree on the wall. The dependency that developed was quiet, domestic, and largely invisible. Women who'd been taking laudanum for years simply continued taking it, gradually requiring more to achieve the same effect, their days organized around the bottle in the medicine cabinet. When they ran out, they became anxious, then physically ill, sweating, shaking, experiencing a profound and consuming misery that lifted only when the next dose arrived. This is textbook opioid withdrawal, and it was happening in sitting rooms across England while the social conversation about dangerous drugs was focused almost entirely on the opium dens of Chinese immigrant communities, where working-class men smoked a preparation of the same drug and were regarded as a moral catastrophe requiring legislative action. The pharmacology was identical. The social responses were not. Children were dosed freely. Working-class mothers in industrial cities used preparations like Godfrey's cordial, opium, treacle, and water to quiet infants while they worked long factory shifts. The doses killed some children outright and created physical dependence in others. This was known. The knowing produced little action. The opium was in the respectable medicine, the children's syrup, the elegant bottle in the sitting room, and so the idea that it required the kind of urgent response one might bring to a genuine public health crisis arrived, like most genuinely important ideas, quite a bit later than it should have. In 1804, a young German pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Serturner did something that seemed straightforward at the time and turned out to have consequences that would echo across the next 2 centuries. He isolated the active compound in opium. Working in a small pharmacy in Paderborn, with tools that would make a modern chemistry student wince, Serturner extracted a white crystalline substance from raw opium and tested it on himself. This was, and remains, a method of drug testing that is not recommended by any accredited institution anywhere on Earth. What he found was that the compound produced dramatically more potent effects than opium in its raw form. He named it Morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, which in retrospect is one of the more poetic decisions in pharmaceutical history, and also one of the more prophetic, since dreams and a morphine would soon become deeply, uncomfortably intertwined for several million people who hadn't been consulted on the matter. Serturner was 21 years old when he began this work, and had no formal scientific training beyond his pharmaceutical apprenticeship. The feat of isolating morphine from raw opium, separating a single active compound from a complex organic mixture, was a genuine achievement by any standard, and it represented something new in the history of medicine, the possibility of understanding why a natural substance worked, rather than simply observing that it did. Before Serturner, medicine with opium was essentially a conversation between a physician and a plant. After Serturner, it became a conversation between a physician and a molecule. This was progress. It was also, in the way that most genuine progress is, the beginning of a new and more sophisticated category of mistake. The crystalline morphine that Serturner extracted was, weight for weight, dramatically more potent than raw opium. A grain of morphine contained the active effect of many times that quantity of the raw plant material. This meant that the dosing errors that had always been possible with opium, taking a bit too much, getting a preparation that was slightly stronger than expected, became more consequential when dealing with a purified compound. The margin between a therapeutic dose and a dangerous one shrank. The potential for accidental overdose grew. These facts were noted in time, but they were noted after the compound had already been widely distributed. Sir Turner published his findings and received recognition that eventually included the Montyon Prize from the Institut de France, which was the scientific world's way of saying thank you very much, we will take it from here. German pharmaceutical companies began producing morphine commercially by the 1820s and 30s. It moved into standard medical use with remarkable speed, in part because it genuinely worked. It worked better than raw opium for pain management, worked better for surgical anesthesia, worked better for the management of dysentery and other gastrointestinal conditions that caused enormous suffering in a world without antibiotics. The fact that it also worked too well, in certain specific senses, took longer to become apparent. Sir Turner himself lived until 1841 and spent a significant portion of his later life consuming morphine, which may or may not say something meaningful about the relationship between discoverers and their discoveries. He had introduced to the world a compound of extraordinary power and extraordinary danger, and he had done it with the tools available to him, in the knowledge available to him, operating entirely within the ethical framework of his time. This is not exculpation, it is context. The tragedy of morphine is not primarily a story of bad intentions. It is a story about a gap between what was known and what was needed to be known, a gap that would be crossed in the wrong direction many times before it was finally partially bridged. For most of its early history, morphine was taken orally, which meant it worked slowly, and there was at least a brief window during which the body could make peace with what was happening to it. Then, in the 1850s, the hypodermic needle arrived. Alexander Wood, a Scottish physician, is often credited with popularising the technique of injecting morphine directly into the bloodstream, and his reasoning was actually quite logical. Injecting it would localise the effect, he believed, making it more targeted and therefore less likely to cause the broader systemic problems he'd observed with oral doses. He was wrong about this in almost every measurable way. What injecting morphine actually did was make it hit faster, harder, and far more profoundly than anything swallowed ever could. The rush was immediate, the relief was total, and the groundwork for dependency, which had previously been building at a polite, manageable pace, now accelerated at a rate nobody was prepared for. The hypodermic syringe, as Wood used it, was a remarkable piece of technology for its time. A hollow needle connected to a small glass barrel and a plunger, capable of delivering a precise volume of fluid directly beneath the skin. The design was elegant and the principle was sound. Injected medication bypassed the digestive system, took effect more rapidly, and allowed for more consistent dosing than oral preparations. For surgical and emergency use, these properties were genuinely valuable. For opioids specifically, they were transformative in ways that were not entirely welcome. When you swallow morphine, it is absorbed gradually through the gastrointestinal tract, travels to the liver for initial processing, and arrives in the brain at a concentration that builds slowly over 30 to 60 minutes. When you inject morphine, it enters the bloodstream directly and reaches the brain in minutes, at a much higher initial concentration. The subjective experience is qualitatively different, faster, more intense, and accompanied by a characteristic wave of warmth and well-being that oral administration does not reliably produce. This distinction between the slow build of oral dosing and the rapid rush of injection is pharmacologically important, because the speed of drug delivery to the brain is one of the most significant factors in addiction potential. The faster the drug hits, the more powerfully it imprints itself on the brain's reward circuitry. This was not understood in 1853. It is well understood now. Wood reportedly tested the technique on his wife, who became one of the first documented cases of injection-related morphine dependence, a fact that hangs over the history of the hypodermic syringe with a weight that Wood presumably did not intend. Physicians across Europe and America rapidly adopted the method. The syringe kit became a standard piece of medical equipment, and then a standard piece of middle-class household equipment, sold in leather cases, polished, presented as a mark of modern scientific medicine that a respectable home should possess. The idea that a family might own its own syringe and morphine supply and self-administer when needed was not considered alarming. It was considered convenient. What followed was predictable in retrospect and genuinely surprising to contemporaries. Rates of morphine dependency climbed. Patients who had been managed on modest oral doses began requesting injection. The relief was faster, they said. The injection worked better. The dose needed to achieve the same effect increased. Physicians who had been treating pain were now, in a significant number of cases, treating the symptoms of withdrawal from their own treatment. The tool designed to deliver medicine had become a tool that made medicine harder to stop, and the war, which was coming, would put this tool in the hands of military surgeons operating under conditions in which speed and relief were the only values that mattered, and the long-term consequences could be left for someone else to manage. If there is a single historical event most responsible for making morphine a widespread American problem, it is the American Civil War. A conflict that was catastrophic in ways that extended well beyond the battlefield. Between 1861 and 1865, military surgeons used morphine on a scale never seen before. The drug was injected into wounded soldiers by the thousands, used liberally to manage pain after amputations, surgeries, and the general horror of 19th century battlefield medicine. Surgeons weren't being careless. By the standards of the time, they were being merciful. Morphine worked better than anything else available. It stopped pain. It calmed men who might otherwise die from shock. The problem, which became apparent only after the war ended and the soldiers went home, was that an enormous number of them had developed a profound physical dependence that didn't simply stop when the fighting did. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 veterans returned home with what contemporaries called the soldier's disease, a persistent, consuming need for morphine that had followed them home more faithfully than most things from the war. The scale of the Civil War was, in medical terms, something the existing infrastructure of American medicine was entirely unprepared to manage. Over 600,000 men died, more than in any other American conflict before or since, and the wounded numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Battlefield surgery was performed in conditions that would horrify any modern practitioner. Improvised tables, inadequate lighting, instruments cleaned inadequately between patients if at all, amputations performed at industrial pace because they represented the most reliable way to prevent the infection that killed more men than bullets did. In this context, morphine was not a luxury or an indulgence. It was the difference between a man screaming himself into cardiac arrest on a surgical table and a man lying still enough for the surgeon to work. Surgeons administered morphine by injection, by pill, and by direct application to wounds. They did not typically track how much they administered to any individual patient. They did not warn patients about dependency, because the concept of morphine dependency as a medical problem was not yet widely understood or accepted. When a wounded soldier received morphine in a field hospital, and then received more morphine in a recovery ward, and then was sent home with a bottle of the pills to manage continued pain, the chain of events that followed was not anyone's deliberate intention. It was the entirely predictable outcome of a powerful opioid administered repeatedly to a large population in pain, without any framework for managing the dependence that would develop. Veterans came home to a country that had no treatment infrastructure for opioid dependence, no clear medical consensus on what the condition even was, and a social framework that tended to interpret the visible symptoms of withdrawal and drug seeking as weakness of character rather than physiological necessity. Some veterans managed their habits through physician prescriptions that continued for years. Others obtained morphine through mail-order patent medicines that contained it without listing it prominently. Others descended into a poverty cycle, driven by the cost of maintaining their habit. The soldier's disease was real, it was widespread, and it was largely invisible. A private suffering that did not announce itself as a public health emergency, the way that cholera or smallpox did, but that consumed the lives of hundreds of thousands of men who had survived the war only to find themselves fighting a different one. The late 19th century was a golden age for confidence in medicine, and a dark age for what we would today call clinical evidence. If someone was suffering from something, anything, there was almost certainly a patent medicine on the shelf to address it, and a significant portion of those medicines contained opiates in quantities that would horrify a modern pharmacist. Soothing syrups for infants with names like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained enough morphine to sedate a small adult. Cough preparations, tonics, women's remedies, nerve medicines, all freely available, all advertised in newspapers alongside soap and sea catalogues, and almost none of them required a prescription, or came with any meaningful warning about what happened if you used them for longer than a week. The regulatory infrastructure simply didn't exist yet. The idea that a medicine needed to be proven safe before it could be sold was, at this point in history, not a law. It was barely even a suggestion. The patent medicine industry in the United States was enormous, profitable, and almost entirely self-regulated, which is to say, not regulated at all. Companies were not required to disclose ingredients. They were not required to prove efficacy. They were not required to do anything except pay a modest registration fee in exchange for the word patent on the label, which suggested government endorsement without actually representing it. Advertisements in newspapers promised cures for conditions ranging from rheumatism to consumption to what was described, with remarkable vagueness, as female weakness. These claims were not true. The medicines did not cure anything. What they did in many cases was contain morphine, heroin, cocaine, or alcohol in quantities sufficient to make the user feel temporarily better, which was functionally indistinguishable from a cure to someone who did not understand how opioids worked. The people who made and sold these medicines were not, for the most part, operating outside what was considered acceptable business practice. They were doing exactly what the market permitted, and what the law did not prohibit. Some were cynical. Others genuinely believed in their products, in the way that is possible when the feedback loop between a drug that causes dependence and a customer who keeps buying is interpreted not as evidence of addiction, but as evidence of efficacy. Your product works because customers keep returning. The customers keep returning because they are physically dependent. You never have to know the difference, and in the 1880s very few people did. The physician's role in all of this was complicated. Many physicians prescribed patent medicines or recommended them to patients. Many prescribed morphine directly for conditions it was genuinely useful for, and some for conditions it was not. The medical training of the era did not include addiction medicine, because addiction medicine did not yet exist as a field. What physicians knew about dependence came from observation. Patients who seemed to need increasing doses, patients who became distressed when their prescriptions were delayed, patients who sought the drug from multiple sources. These observations were made but were not yet unified into a coherent picture of what opioid dependence was and how it worked. The picture was coming together, slowly, in the last decades of the 19th century, just in time for Bayer to introduce a new product that made it dramatically more urgent. You know Bayer. They make aspirin. What is slightly less prominently featured in their marketing materials is that in 1898, the same Bayer pharmaceutical company introduced two new products to the market simultaneously, aspirin and heroin. Aspirin became one of the most widely used drugs in human history. Heroin became one of the most catastrophic. The Heroin project was led by a chemist named Heinrich Drieser, who had synthesized diacetyl morphine, the chemical name for what would become heroin, by acetylating morphine, which is a fancy way of saying he modified its chemical structure in a way that made it cross the blood-brain barrier significantly faster. Drieser's clinical trials, which were conducted with a speed and brevity that should have been alarming but was actually quite normal for the era, suggested that the new compound was effective for respiratory conditions and, crucially, appeared to produce less dependency than morphine. Bayer called it heroin, a name derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, because test subjects reported feeling strong, powerful, and capable when they took it. This, in retrospect, was a warning sign dressed up as a brand name. Dresser was, by the standards of his time and profession, a serious scientist. He was not a fraud. He conducted studies, he measured outcomes, he published results. The problem was not dishonesty. The problem was a combination of limited study duration, inadequate understanding of tolerance and dependency mechanisms, and a corporate context in which a positive result had significant commercial value and a negative result did not. Bayer needed a new product. Aspirin was promising but uncertain in the market. A non-addictive substitute for morphine, a drug with enormous therapeutic demand and an equally enormous reputation problem, would be commercially extraordinary if the claims held up. The trials ran for a few weeks and showed what a few weeks of opioid use will generally show. Subjects felt better, reported fewer withdrawal symptoms from morphine than expected, and did not immediately exhibit the signs of dependency. What a few weeks of study cannot reliably show is what happens over months of use, because tolerance and dependence on opioids develop over time, not overnight. Bayer began marketing heroin internationally in 1898. Within 2 years, it was being sold in over 20 countries. The marketing materials were thorough and confident. Heroin was described as effective for coughs, bronchitis, tuberculosis symptoms, and asthma. It was promoted as a treatment for morphine addiction, specifically because it appeared to suppress the withdrawal symptoms of morphine cessation, which it did reliably by replacing morphine in the brain's receptor sites with a more potent compound. This was not, as any pharmacist with a moment's reflection could have noted, a cure for morphine addiction. It was a substitution of one opioid for another, faster-acting one. But the framework for understanding that distinction did not yet exist in any clear public form, and Bayer's marketing filled the vacuum with language that was confident, scientific-sounding, and spectacularly wrong. The commercial success was rapid. Heroin was adopted by hospitals, recommended by physicians, and purchased by ordinary households. Sales representatives distributed samples to physicians in a practice that would have been familiar to anyone who witnessed the OxyContin rollout a century later. The testimonials from physicians who had tried heroin on their patients and reported excellent results were gathered and circulated. The counter-evidence, which was beginning to accumulate in clinical practices across Europe and America as patients started returning for more, was not yet organised, not yet published, and not yet loud enough to compete with a well-funded marketing campaign from a respected pharmaceutical company. It would get louder. From 1898 to approximately 1903, heroin was marketed by Bayer as a non-addictive substitute for morphine and as a cough suppressant, and it was sold directly to consumers without a prescription. It came in tablets, in solutions, and in at least one formulation specifically designed for use in children's cough medicine. Parents gave it to their children. Physicians prescribed it to morphine-dependent patients as a way of weaning them off something stronger. This was the pharmaceutical equivalent of treating a house fire with a slightly larger house fire, and the results were predictably not great. Patients who had been managing a morphine habit began taking heroin instead, and found that it worked faster, felt more intense, and required increasingly larger doses to achieve the same effect, which is the pharmacological definition of a tolerance-building substance, and therefore the pharmacological definition of addiction, which is precisely what Bayer had claimed it was not. The children's cough medicine question deserves its own moment of reflection, because it is the detail that consistently produces the strongest reaction from contemporary readers, and for good reason. Heroin syrup was given to children with persistent coughs, which in the 1890s meant it was being given to children with tuberculosis, bronchitis, whooping cough, and the general respiratory misery that accompanied childhood in an era before antibiotics and central heating. The heroin did, in a narrow pharmacological sense, suppress the cough. Opioids are effective cough suppressants, which is why codeine persists in cough medicines to this day. The problem was that heroin did considerably more than suppress the cough, and nobody had established what constituted a safe dose for an infant, or indeed whether there was such a thing. The absence of regulatory oversight in this period is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the vantage point of a world in which drugs go through years of clinical trials before reaching patients, and even that process is sometimes criticized as insufficiently rigorous. In 1898, there was no Food and Drug Administration equivalent in the United States. There was no requirement that a drug manufacturer demonstrate safety or efficacy before sale. There was no requirement to list ingredients. A company could synthesize a new compound on Monday, test it on a handful of willing subjects on Tuesday, and begin shipping it to pharmacies on Wednesday, as long as they paid whatever state licensing fees applied. This is not hyperbole. It is the actual regulatory environment in which heroin was introduced. The shift in the medical community's view of heroin happened gradually and then suddenly, which is the way that shifts in medical consensus generally work. Individual physicians began reporting troubling patterns to medical journals in the early years of the new century. Patients whose heroin use had escalated, patients exhibiting withdrawal symptoms, patients who seemed unable to function without the drug. The reports accumulated. The pattern became harder to dismiss. By 1903 and 1904, the medical literature contained enough case reports of heroin dependence that the straightforward claim of non-addictiveness was no longer tenable. Bayer quietly stopped promoting that particular claim. The product remained on the market for years afterward, in various forms and under various regulatory regimes, but the heroic era of heroin as cure was drawing to its close, leaving behind a population of dependent patients, a thoroughly undermined theory of opioid safety, and a name, heroin, that would never again be used to sell cough syrup to children. Here is the part where we briefly pause to explain, without judgment, why heroin is pharmacologically more intense than morphine, because understanding this is understanding why the entire medical catastrophe that followed was both predictable and somehow completely unanticipated by everyone involved. When morphine is injected or swallowed, it crosses into the brain relatively slowly, because the brain has a protective mechanism called the blood-brain barrier that tries to limit what chemicals get through. Heroin, being diacetyl morphine, is more fat-soluble than morphine, which means it passes through that barrier much more rapidly. Once inside the brain, it converts back into morphine, but the speed of delivery is everything. The faster an opioid hits the brain's receptors, the more intensely euphoric the effect, and the more powerfully it imprints itself on the brain's reward circuitry. Morphine is a key that fits the lock. Heroin is the same key, but it gets there running instead of walking, and the brain notices the difference in ways that matter enormously when you're trying to understand why people find it so difficult to stop. The opioid receptors that morphine and heroin act on, predominantly the mu-opioid receptors, scattered through the brain and spinal cord, are part of the body's own endogenous pain management and reward system. The brain produces its own opioid-like molecules, called endorphins and enkephalins, which bind to these same receptors and produce the natural feelings of comfort, reduced pain, and mild euphoria, associated with activities like vigorous exercise, eating, or social bonding. Morphine and heroin work by mimicking these natural molecules at a scale that the brain's own chemistry cannot match. When you inject heroin, you're flooding a system designed for endorphin-level inputs with a molecular signal many times more powerful than anything the brain expects to receive through normal experience. The brain responds to this in the way that any sensible system responds to being overwhelmed. It adapts. Over time, with repeated exposure to opioids, the brain downregulates its own receptor sensitivity, reducing the number and responsiveness of mu-opioid receptors in what amounts to a defensive recalibration. The result is that the same dose produces a weaker effect. More drug is required to achieve the original sensation. This is tolerance, and it is not a moral failing. It is biology doing exactly what biology does when a system is consistently overstimulated. Tolerance develops faster with heroin than with morphine, because heroin delivers its molecular signal faster, producing more pronounced peaks that trigger more aggressive adaptive responses. Alongside tolerance develops physical dependence, the state in which the brain has so thoroughly recalibrated itself around the presence of the drug that its absence produces a physiological crisis. Opioid withdrawal in someone who has been using heavily is not simply uncomfortable. It involves diarrhea, vomiting, severe muscle cramps, profound insomnia, sweating, shaking, an overwhelming and physical sense of dread and misery that is partly the nervous system, stripped of its opioid cushioning, firing at full sensitivity. People in opioid withdrawal describe it as a feeling that their skin is simultaneously crawling off their body and too tight to contain them. This is not metaphor. It is the experience of a nervous system that has been chemically altered, operating without the chemical it has organized itself around. Understanding this does not make every choice that follows inevitable. It does make the choices considerably more comprehensible. Before any regulatory body, newspaper editorial board or government committee got around to noticing that heroin had a problem, the patients who were taking it had already figured it out. By the early 1900s, physicians across the United States and Europe were beginning to receive a consistent and deeply uncomfortable pattern of complaints. Patients who had been prescribed heroin for coughs, for pain, or as a morphine substitute were returning to their offices requesting more, then requesting significantly more, then exhibiting symptoms that looked unmistakably like the withdrawal that Bayer had promised the drug would not cause. Some patients had self-escalated their doses to levels that bore no resemblance to the therapeutic quantities on the label. Others had switched from oral tablets to injection, having discovered that the effect was faster and more complete that way. The drug had followed, almost step by step, the exact same trajectory that morphine had taken, the same dependency curve, the same escalating tolerance, the same inability to stop, just compressed into a shorter timeline, which was, if anything, worse. The physicians receiving these patients were in a genuinely difficult position. The drug had been recommended by Bayer. It had been covered approvingly in the medical literature. Many physicians had themselves prescribed it enthusiastically and had told patients it was safe. Now they were sitting across the desk from patients who were visibly dependent on it, and who were not, in any meaningful sense, different from the morphine-dependent patients they had been trying to treat in the first place. The expected response: acknowledge the error, revise the treatment approach, report the adverse outcomes to some central authority, was complicated by the fact that no central authority existed to report to, and that acknowledging the error publicly meant acknowledging that you had prescribed a harmful substance to people who trusted you. Some physicians did report. The medical journals of the early 1900s contain case reports that are worth reading in their original language because they have a quality of careful, clinical bewilderment that is somehow more affecting than outrage would be. Physicians describe patients who came in for cough treatment and are now, 6 months later, requiring doses of heroin that would have been alarming on a morphine scale. They describe patients who deny the dependency with what seems like genuine conviction, even when every observable symptom says otherwise. They describe their own uncertainty about what to do next, whether to continue prescribing to prevent withdrawal, taper the dose despite the patient's distress, or simply refuse and watch what happens. These were not easy questions, and the answers that exist now did not exist then. What the patients themselves experienced in this period is harder to reconstruct, because they left fewer records. Some found physicians willing to continue prescribing. Some purchased heroin through pharmacies without a prescription while that was still legal. Some began obtaining it from less formal sources as the legal landscape changed. Some simply lived with a dependency that had arrived uninvited through a prescription for a cough, and that now organized their days the way any significant physical need organizes a person's days, urgently, persistently, without much room for anything else. They were not criminals. They were not degenerates. They were people who had taken a medicine that had been sold to them under false pretenses, and whose bodies had responded in the only way available to them. In 1914, the United States Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which represented the federal government's first serious attempt to regulate opiates and cocaine. The act required that anyone distributing narcotics register with the government and pay a tax, and it effectively made non-medical distribution illegal. In theory, this was a reasonable public health measure. In practice, it also meant that physicians who had been maintaining addicted patients on regular morphine prescriptions, keeping them stable, employed, and alive, suddenly found themselves in legal jeopardy for doing so. The law created a grey area that courts and law enforcement quickly filled in with the most restrictive possible interpretation: that maintaining an addict's habit was not a legitimate medical purpose, and therefore not protected by the Act. Within a few years, thousands of physicians had been prosecuted, and the maintenance of addicted patients through legitimate prescriptions had effectively been criminalized, a decision whose consequences would shape American drug policy for the next 100 years. The political context of Harrison is important, because it explains why the law took the shape it did. The years between 1905 and 1915 saw a significant intensification of anti-drug sentiment in American public discourse, driven by a combination of genuine concern about the documented harms of opiate dependency, progressive-era reformism, and a considerably less admirable strain of racial anxiety that associated opium with Chinese immigrants, cocaine with black men, and both drugs with the idea of social contamination of respectable white communities. The Shanghai International Opium Commission of 1909, which the United States attended and helped shape, provided an international platform for American anti-opium advocacy. The domestic political will to act was building. Harrison was drafted to satisfy international treaty obligations while creating a regulatory framework domestically. Its authors likely did not intend to criminalize medical treatment of addiction. The Act's language permitted physicians to prescribe narcotics in the course of their professional practice, but the Treasury Department, which was responsible for enforcing the tax provisions, took the position that maintaining an addicted patient was not a professional medical practice in any legitimate sense, and federal courts largely upheld this interpretation through the 1920s. The practical result was a rapid contraction of legitimate medical infrastructure for opioid management and a corresponding expansion of the illegal market to serve the population that had been cut off. The experiment with narcotics clinics that followed 44 clinics operating in cities across the United States between 1919 and 1923 showed something important and was shut down before that importance could be fully processed. The clinics dispense regulated doses of heroin or morphine to registered addicts. Crime in the areas around the clinics fell. Patients maintained employment and social functioning. Deaths from overdose among the clinic population were essentially eliminated. The clinics were closed anyway, under pressure from the Treasury's Narcotics Enforcement Division, and from a cultural moment that had decided that maintenance was immoral. The data from those 4 years would not resurface in any policy-relevant form for decades. By 1915, the morphine addict in America occupied a peculiar social position, simultaneously a medical patient and a criminal suspect, depending on who was looking at them and from which angle. Before Harrison, the stereotypical opiate-dependent person was, statistically speaking, a middle-aged white woman, often middle or upper class, who developed her habit through legitimate medical prescriptions, took her drug of choice in the form of laudanum or patent medicines, and was generally regarded by society as someone with a fragile constitution rather than a moral failing. The drug in this configuration was a domestic problem, a quiet one, managed through discreet repurchases at the pharmacy. After Harrison, that image began to shift in ways that were not entirely accidental. Law enforcement, journalists and reformers increasingly associated narcotics use with immigrants, with black communities, with the urban poor. A recasting of who the addict was that would have profound effects on how addiction would be policed, treated, and talked about for decades to come. The actual population of opiate-dependent people in 1915 was diverse in ways that the dominant cultural narrative was not. Veterans with the soldier's disease, middle-class women with decades-long laudanum habits, working-class men who had discovered patent medicines as a way of managing pain that their jobs and their poverty ensured was constant, people who had been prescribed morphine for a genuine medical condition and had not stopped, because stopping felt physiologically impossible, and increasingly people who had been introduced to heroin through the black market channels that were beginning to form as legal access contracted. These populations had different demographics, different life circumstances, and in most respects different lives. What they shared was a physiological relationship with an opioid that their nervous systems had organized themselves around, and a society that was increasingly inclined to interpret that relationship as a reflection of character. The moral framing of addiction had enormous practical consequences. It meant that treatment, to the extent that treatment existed, tended to focus on willpower and moral instruction, rather than on the physiological mechanisms that made cessation so difficult. It meant that physicians were reluctant to treat addicted patients as patients, because the legal and professional risks had grown substantially. It meant that the people most in need of medical support were the least likely to receive it, and the most likely to find themselves in jail, where the treatment for opioid withdrawal was a cell, and the encouragement to stop was a door that didn't open. And it meant that the productive conversation about what addiction actually was, a conversation that could have been had in rudimentary form with the science available in 1915, was delayed by several decades while the culture argued about whether addicts deserved sympathy. The women who had been the face of opiate dependency before Harrison largely disappeared from public view. Their habits, which had been considered unfortunate and medical, were quietly reframed as shameful now that the law had made them technically criminal, and the social pressure to keep them private intensified. The new face of the addict, as constructed by newspaper coverage, government reports, and reform literature, was young, male, urban, and non-white. A face that justified punishment more readily than treatment, and that bore only a partial resemblance to the statistical reality of who was actually dependent on opiates in the United States. The gap between the constructed image and the statistical reality would persist in various forms for the rest of the century. When legal access to heroin was effectively shut off in the years following Harrison, the drug did not disappear, it migrated. Supply chains that had previously run through pharmacies and physicians shifted to a network of street-level distribution that operated outside any regulatory framework, which meant no quality control, no dosing consistency, no medical oversight, and no accountability. The users who remained dependent on the drug, and there were many, now had to obtain it from sources who had every incentive to cut it with adulterants, to increase profit margins, and no incentive whatsoever to ensure that what they were selling wouldn't kill anyone. The price rose, the purity fell, overdose risk, which had always existed, increased dramatically now that no one could be certain what concentration of drug they were actually receiving. The tools of harm reduction, which in this era were essentially non-existent, became even less relevant, because there was nothing to reduce toward when the drug's potency was unknown from purchase to purchase. The underground heroin supply in the 1920s drew on international production networks that were already in place for the legal pharmaceutical trade, and that proved straightforwardly adaptable to illegal distribution. Raw opium was grown primarily in China, Persia, Turkey, and India. It was processed into morphine and then into heroin in facilities that had previously operated legally and now operated in the grey zones of countries with weaker enforcement capacity. The finished product moved through trade routes that tracked maritime commerce, arriving in American port cities, New York, Boston, San Francisco, New Orleans, where distribution networks that also handled alcohol during Prohibition were well positioned to add a new product line. The Prohibition comparison is instructive and was made at the time by observers who were watching the consequences of criminalization unfold for alcohol and narcotics simultaneously. The argument was not that heroin should be legal exactly, but that the gap between demand and legal supply had consequences that fell not on the people who had created the demand through regulatory failure and pharmaceutical overconfidence, but on the people caught between a physiological need and a law that offered no medical accommodation. The argument was made. It was not, at the time, well received. What the underground market created alongside the supply was a culture, a set of practices, a shared language, a community of shared experience that formed partly because opioid dependence isolates people from the mainstream social world, and partly because the illegal context of obtaining the drug requires cooperation, networks, and relationships that organize themselves into something resembling community. The world of the heroin addict that would become familiar in 20th century American culture, the shooting gallery, the dealer relationship, the economy of petty crime and sex work that surrounds maintenance of an expensive illegal habit, did not spring from the nature of heroin itself. It sprang from the specific regulatory choices that had been made about how to manage the gap between a drug's pharmacological power and a society's desire not to think too hard about what that power meant. Between the two world wars, heroin addiction in America existed largely in a legal and cultural no man's land. The disease model of addiction, the idea that physical dependence represents a medical condition rather than a character defect, had been proposed by some physicians but was nowhere near consensus. Addiction treatment, such as it was, tended toward approaches that would strike a modern clinician as either useless or actively harmful. Cold turkey withdrawal in prison or hospital settings, moral counselling, institutionalization. A brief experiment with narcotics clinics, facilities that legally dispensed opiates to registered addicts as a public health measure, showed some promise in the early 1920s, but they were shut down under pressure from the Treasury Department's Narcotics Division, which regarded them as effectively licensing addiction. The people who remained dependent had limited options and very little sympathy from the society around them, which had largely concluded that the problem was one of weak will rather than altered brain chemistry. The federal narcotics farm at Lexington, Kentucky, opened in 1935, represented the era's most ambitious attempt to create something that looked like a treatment facility for addiction, though in practice it functioned somewhere between a hospital and a prison, which tells you something about the era's inability to decide which category addiction belonged to. Addicted people arrived both voluntarily and involuntarily, went through supervised withdrawal, received counselling and occupational therapy, and were discharged typically after several months. The relapse rates were high, overwhelmingly high in fact, but this was interpreted not as evidence that the treatment model was inadequate, but as evidence that the patients were inadequate. The circular reasoning persisted. The Lexington facility did, over its decades of operation, become the site of significant research into the biology of addiction. Researchers working there made important observations about tolerance, withdrawal, and the physiological mechanisms of dependence that would eventually contribute to the scientific framework that replaced the moral one. They documented the severity and consistency of opioid withdrawal symptoms in ways that made it difficult to maintain the position that stopping was simply a matter of choosing to do so. They conducted studies on relapse that began to suggest that the environment to which a person returned after treatment was at least as important as anything that happened during treatment. These findings were important. Their translation into policy and public understanding was slow. Meanwhile, the people living with heroin dependence outside any treatment framework organized their lives as best they could around the supply chain that was available to them. The 1930s heroin market operated in specific urban neighborhoods, served a population that was increasingly young, increasingly male, and increasingly associated with the communities that had been most economically devastated by the Depression. The geography of heroin was not accidental. It tracked poverty. It tracked the collapse of other economic options. It tracked the neighborhoods where law enforcement was most aggressive about lesser offenses and least interested in providing services. The drug settled where vulnerability was concentrated, as it would continue to do. The Second World War disrupted global heroin supply chains in ways that produced a brief and ironic reduction in heroin availability in the United States. Ironic because the disruption came not from policy or treatment, but from the simple logistical fact that war makes international drug smuggling more difficult. Occupying armies, naval blockades, and the general chaos of global conflict temporarily interrupted the routes through which heroin moved from production regions to American streets. Rates of opioid dependency dropped measurably during the war years, which provided researchers with something genuinely useful: evidence that heroin addiction, however powerful, was not a permanent biological state, and that forced abstinence, however brutal, was possible. It also suggested, though nobody immediately drew the correct conclusion, that supply availability played a significant role in addiction rates, a finding that would take several more decades and several more drug crises to fully integrate into policy thinking. The wartime interruption was not, it must be said, a benign phenomenon for the people who'd been dependent on heroin before supply collapsed. Withdrawal without medical support is a genuinely dangerous experience, and the sudden unavailability of heroin in the early war years forced hundreds of thousands of dependent people into abrupt cold turkey cessation without any of the medical monitoring or pharmacological support that would, in subsequent decades, be recognized as standard of care. Some people died. More survived the withdrawal, but were left in the liminal state that researchers would later call post-acute withdrawal syndrome, a months-long period of psychological flatness, craving, and vulnerability to relapse that explains why a period of abstinence does not simply reset the brain's relationship with opioids. The war also created new opioid-dependent populations through its use of morphine in military medicine, repeating in certain respects the pattern of the Civil War. Military surgeons in both the European and Pacific theatres used morphine extensively, and returning veterans in the post-war years added to the population of opioid-dependent Americans, though at rates that were lower than the Civil War era, partly because post-war medical understanding of dependency was somewhat more sophisticated, and partly because morphine administration in combat medicine had become somewhat more disciplined. The word somewhat is doing significant work in that sentence. What the wartime period most clearly demonstrated in retrospect was that heroin dependency was a public health phenomenon that tracked closely with supply and social conditions rather than purely individual pathology. When supply dried up, rates fell. When social devastation, poverty, lack of opportunity, trauma increased, rates rose. When the war ended and economic prosperity returned for most Americans in the post-war boom, heroin dependency rates initially remained low, before rising sharply in specific communities in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The communities where rates rose were the ones that had been systematically excluded from the post-war prosperity: black communities in northern cities, communities where the GI Bill's benefits had been administered in ways that left black veterans behind, communities where housing discrimination confined people to neighbourhoods that the rest of the economy was organised to pass by. The post-war period brought heroin back to American cities with a particular ferocity, and this time it concentrated itself geographically and demographically in ways that shaped cultural attitudes toward the drug for a generation. By the late 1940s and through the 1950s, heroin use rose sharply in urban black communities, in part because returning veterans had brought exposure to the drug back with them, in part because economic conditions in post-war America left many communities with very little in the way of alternative pathways, and in part because heroin, which could be obtained cheaply and which offered a profound and temporary exit from circumstances that were not improving, made a brutal kind of sense in that context. The association with jazz subculture, with bebop musicians and the bohemian underground, gave heroin a cultural mythology that was simultaneously romanticized in art and weaponized in public discourse to justify punitive rather than therapeutic responses to addiction. The jazz connection was real, not invented. Heroin use was genuinely widespread among jazz musicians of the late 1940s and 1950s, and the reasons for this are more complicated than the simple glamorization of vice. Jazz musicians at this time worked long hours in conditions of chronic financial instability, dealt with the constant physical and psychological demands of performance, and navigated the specific stress of being black artists in an industry that sold their music to white audiences while offering them few of the protections and opportunities available to white performers. Heroin managed the pain, the anxiety, the insomnia, the aftermath of performances that had been brilliant and would leave the performer physically wrecked. That many musicians who used heroin described it not as pleasure, but as management of otherwise unmanageable conditions is a detail that tends to get lost in the mythology. Charlie Parker is the figure most associated with this history, and his relationship with heroin is instructive in the way that tragedies are instructive, not because they confirm what we already believed, but because they complicate it. Parker's heroin dependency, which began in his adolescence, was inseparable from his musical genius in the sense that both were features of the same life, shaped by the same conditions. To separate the genius from the addiction, to ask what he would have been without it, is to ask what he would have been had he lived a different life, in a different body, in a different America, a question that has no answer and obscures the one that does. What are the conditions that produce a world in which a person of extraordinary gifts arrives at heroin as a solution to something? The policy response to the 50s heroin epidemic was aggressive prosecution, mandatory minimum sentencing under the Narcotic Control Act of 1956, and dramatically increased penalties for possession and distribution. The Narcotic Control Act introduced the death penalty as a potential sentence for selling heroin to a minor. The incarceration rates in affected communities rose sharply. The heroin problem did not. The lesson available here, that punishment scales do not alter the underlying conditions that drive drug use, was available to be learned in the 1950s. It was not taken. In 1953, William S. Burroughs published Junkie, a semi-autobiographical account of his own heroin addiction, and it was, in terms of what it communicated about the phenomenology of opioid dependence, one of the most accurate documents of its time. Burroughs described addiction not as euphoria and pleasure, but as a grey, maintenance-level compulsion. The pursuit of the drug not to feel good, he wrote, but to feel nothing, to achieve a baseline of normalcy that existed nowhere else for the addicted brain. The famous formulation was that junk was not a kick but a way of life. Total, occupying, organising everything around the simple imperative of maintaining supply. This description matched, almost precisely, what researchers would later understand about the neurobiology of opioid dependence, the way chronic exposure shifts the brain's reward system so that the drug becomes less about pleasure and more about the restoration of a chemically altered baseline. Burroughs arrived at this understanding without knowing anything about mu-opioid receptors and described it with an accuracy that a pharmacology textbook couldn't quite match. Junkie was published originally under the pseudonym William Lee and was paired in its first paperback edition with a booklet warning readers of the dangers of drug addiction, a framing device that the publisher felt was necessary to justify the book's existence. The text itself needed no such justification. What Burroughs had written was not an endorsement of heroin use and not primarily a cautionary tale. It was a documentary, a precise and largely unemotional account of what heroin addiction actually looked like from the inside, stripped of both the romantic mythology that surrounded the drug in jazz culture and the moral condemnation that surrounded it in official discourse. The picture Burroughs drew was not seductive, it was administrative. You woke up and you needed a fix. You obtained a fix. The fix made you well, which is to say it made you feel approximately normal, which is to say it removed the withdrawal symptoms that had been building since the last fix. You felt neither good nor bad exactly. You felt functional, which was its own kind of luxury when the alternative was the crawling, sweating misery of withdrawal. Then you needed another fix. The entire structure of the day organised itself around this need, in a way that left very little room for anything else, for pleasure, for ambition, for the other hungers that constitute a life. The drug had become less a source of joy than a maintenance fee for the privilege of not feeling terrible. This is not how heroin is typically depicted in either the pro-drug mythology or the anti-drug propaganda. It is how heroin is almost universally described by people who've been dependent on it. The literature of addiction that followed Burroughs, from Alexander Trocchi's Cain's book to the more contemporary confessionals of Edward St. Aubyn's Patrick Melrose novels, largely confirmed the picture he had drawn. Not euphoria as the engine of addiction, but the avoidance of suffering. This distinction is pharmacologically important. A drug whose appeal is primarily the removal of pain is considerably more comprehensible, and the dependency it creates considerably more sympathetic than a drug whose appeal is purely pleasure. Understanding this does not make addiction easier to treat. It makes it easier to treat compassionately, which turns out to be a significant step. In the 1960s, two physicians at Rockefeller University, Vincent Dole and Marie Niswander, began conducting research into whether long-acting opioid maintenance could stabilize heroin-dependent patients and allow them to function. The drug they used was methadone, a synthetic opioid that had originally been developed in Germany during World War II as a morphine substitute. Methadone had a significantly longer half-life than heroin or morphine, meaning that a single dose could prevent withdrawal for 24 to 36 hours without producing the intense peaks and valleys of shorter-acting drugs. Dole and Niswander's early results were striking. Patients on methadone maintenance stopped using heroin, stopped engaging in the criminal behavior associated with obtaining heroin, held jobs, maintained relationships, and by most measures lived ordinary lives. The findings were published, replicated, and then, in a pattern that should be familiar by this point, met with significant resistance from law enforcement and drug policy officials who regarded any opioid as a drug and any drug maintenance as an endorsement of addiction rather than a treatment for it. Dole and Niswander had arrived at methadone maintenance through a specifically medical framework. They conceived of heroin addiction as a metabolic disease, comparable in some respects to diabetes, in which the body had developed a specific physiological need that required ongoing management rather than a single curative intervention. The analogy was imperfect but productive. It shifted the question from why can't these people just stop to what does this person's physiology require in order to function, which is a question that leads toward medicine and away from punishment. The methadone maintenance treatment program that grew from their work became one of the most well-studied and well-documented interventions in the history of addiction medicine. The evidence base that accumulated over decades consistently showed that patients in methadone maintenance had significantly lower rates of heroin use, lower rates of criminal activity, lower rates of HIV infection, and lower rates of mortality than comparable populations not in treatment. These were not ambiguous findings. They were the kind of findings that, in most fields of medicine, would have produced rapid adoption of the treatment and substantial investment in expanding access. In the field of addiction, the response was complicated. Methadone maintenance programs were restricted, regulated, and stigmatized in ways that limited their reach. In the United States, patients receiving methadone were required to attend a clinic daily, often for years before earning take-home doses, which made the treatment incompatible with employment for many people, which made it incompatible with the life stability it was supposed to enable. The daily clinic visit requirement was not primarily driven by medical evidence. It was driven by a political calculation that treatment which looked like supervision was more publicly acceptable than treatment that looked like patients simply receiving a drug and going home with it. The tail of drug war politics wagged the dog of evidence-based medicine, with consequences that are difficult to fully quantify and easy to describe in human terms. People who could have been helped more effectively were helped less effectively, and some of them died. By 1971, the United States government was confronting a problem it had not anticipated. A significant percentage of American soldiers serving in Vietnam had developed heroin dependencies while deployed. The drug was widely available in Southeast Asia, cheap, high purity, and accessible to men who were living in conditions of extreme stress with limited recreational options. Estimates from military studies suggested that somewhere between 15 and 20% of enlisted soldiers had used heroin regularly during their deployment. This created what was, in bureaucratic terms, a crisis of optics. The government could not simply criminalize its own veterans, and it could not pretend the problem didn't exist when soldiers were returning visibly dependent. The military's response, mandatory urine testing before return, brief detoxification, and then monitoring at home, produced results that were confusing to prevailing assumptions about heroin addiction. The majority of soldiers who had been dependent in Vietnam did not continue using heroin at home. The change in environment, in context, in access, and in the presence of meaningful social structure appeared to matter enormously. The research that followed from this observation was conducted primarily by Lee Robbins, a sociologist at Washington University, who tracked a sample of Vietnam veterans over the years following their return. Her findings were among the most surprising in the history of addiction research and among the most thoroughly ignored in the history of drug policy. The large majority of veterans who'd been dependent on heroin in Vietnam did not become chronically dependent at home. They stopped using, many without formal treatment, without dramatic struggle, and without the catastrophic relapse rates that conventional addiction theory would have predicted. The drug was the same. The people were the same. What had changed was everything around them: the context of use, the availability of the drug, the presence of family and community, the existence of something, employment, relationships, purpose, that competed with heroin for the brain's attention. Robbins' findings pointed toward what would later be called the environmental theory of addiction, the idea that context is not a secondary factor in addiction, but a primary one, that the conditions surrounding drug use shape whether use becomes dependency and whether dependency becomes chronic in ways that are at least as important as the pharmacology of the drug itself. This was not what the existing models predicted. The existing models said that heroin was so physically and chemically powerful that exposure led to dependency, and dependency was permanent. The Vietnam data said that a large population of people had been genuinely dependent on heroin, and had, when their circumstances changed, stopped without dramatic clinical intervention. The implications for treatment were significant and were, in the way of significant implications, largely unacted upon for a long time. If environment mattered as much as the pharmacology, then treatment that addressed only the pharmacology, detoxification, medication, and returned people to the same environments that had surrounded their drug use was predictably incomplete. Treatment that addressed housing, employment, social connection, trauma history, and economic circumstance, alongside the pharmacology, would be expected to produce better outcomes. This is, in fact, what research on comprehensive addiction treatment has consistently found, and it is also, consistently, the most expensive form of treatment, and therefore the least likely to be funded at scale. In 1970, President Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which established the federal scheduling system still in use today. Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, was reserved for drugs with high abuse potential and no currently accepted medical use. Heroin was placed here, alongside marijuana, psilocybin, and LSD. The logic of heroin's schedule. One designation was straightforward. It was highly addictive, it had been removed from medical use, and it had no accepted therapeutic application. What this scheduling also meant, however, was that researching heroin became extraordinarily difficult, that certain harm reduction approaches became legally complicated, and that any future scientific re-evaluation of diacetyl morphine's potential medical applications, which researchers in Switzerland and Canada would eventually investigate in the context of treatment-resistant addiction, would require navigating a regulatory structure designed around the assumption that the drug had no medical value and never would. The scheduling system was designed to respond to what drugs were. It was not designed to adapt. Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs in 1971 is frequently described, in historical retrospect, as a political rather than a public health initiative, a framing supported by John Ehrlichman's notorious 1994 statement in which Nixon's former domestic policy chief described the war on drugs as designed to associate the anti-war left with marijuana and the black community with heroin, and to criminalize both groups. Whatever the original intent, the structural consequences were clear. Federal resources directed toward enforcement rather than treatment. Mandatory minimum sentencing that removed judicial discretion from drug cases, and a law enforcement apparatus that was incentivized to measure success in arrests and seizures rather than in any health outcome. The scheduling system created a bureaucratic architecture that shaped research priorities for decades. Schedule 1 drugs could be studied only by researchers who obtained a DEA license, who sourced their research material from a federally contracted supplier, and who operated under restrictions that made clinical research genuinely difficult. The effect was not to prevent all research. Significant research on opioid pharmacology continued throughout this period, but to create frictions that slowed the translation of basic science into clinical application and that made certain lines of inquiry effectively impractical. Research into diacetyl morphine as a treatment for opioid dependence, for instance, the kind of research being conducted in Switzerland and later in Canada with promising results, would have required navigating a regulatory obstacle course that provided few incentives for the effort. The 1970s were also the period in which the modern understanding of opioid receptors began to develop. Candace Pert and Solomon Snyder's 1973 discovery of opioid receptors in the brain, specific molecular binding sites that explained why opioids worked and why they worked the way they did, was among the most important findings in neuroscience in the 20th century. It was followed rapidly by the discovery of endorphins, the body's own opioid molecules, which established that the brain had its own internal opioid system that morphine and heroin were exploiting rather than creating from nothing. These discoveries reframed addiction as a phenomenon taking place in a specific biological substrate, with specific mechanisms that could in principle be understood and treated scientifically. The reframing was real, its policy consequences were slow. The 1980s brought crack cocaine to American cities, and the federal government's response to the crack epidemic introduced a sentencing disparity that made a certain kind of implicit logic visible. Crack cocaine, associated with black urban communities, carried penalties 100 times more severe than powder cocaine, associated with white professional users, for the same quantity of drug. The disparity had nothing to do with pharmacology. Crack and powder cocaine are the same substance in different forms, and everything to do with which communities the drug was being associated with, and which communities had the political standing to avoid criminalization. The heroin parallel was not lost on researchers who had spent decades noting that addiction treated as a medical problem produced better outcomes than addiction treated as a criminal one, and that the decision about which framing applied to which drug in which community was not a scientific decision, but a social and political one that tracked very closely with race and class. The crack powder disparity, encoded in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, mandated a 5-year minimum sentence for possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine and the same 5-year minimum for 500 grams of powder cocaine. To arrive at equivalent treatment under the law, a crack user would need to possess 100 times less drug than a powder user. This was the law for 24 years, until the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced the ratio to 18-1. The 100-to-1 ratio was not based on any pharmacological difference between the two forms. It was based on political panic, media coverage that focused almost exclusively on crack's presence in black communities, and a legislative process that moved at a speed inversely proportional to its thoughtfulness. The 80s were also the period of a heroin resurgence driven by the same economic and social conditions that had produced previous epidemics: disinvestment in urban communities, collapse of manufacturing employment, deterioration of public housing and public services in the cities that had been hardest hit by deindustrialization. The heroin available in the 1980s was significantly more potent than the drug available in the 60s, as production and processing had become more sophisticated and competitive. HIV had arrived as an additional catastrophic complication. Intravenous drug use was one of the primary transmission routes for the virus, and the criminalization of needle possession meant that people injecting drugs were sharing equipment in ways that drove explosive HIV transmission through drug-using communities. The public health case for needle exchange programs, facilities that provided clean needles to intravenous drug users in exchange for used ones, was strong. The political case in the 1980s was essentially non-existent, and the federal government refused to fund needle exchange programs for decades on the grounds that doing so would send the wrong message. The wrong message in this context appeared to mean acknowledging that people were injecting drugs and that it was possible to care about their lives. In 1996, Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin, extended-release oxycodone, with a marketing campaign that made claims about addiction risk that were, to put it generously, not well supported by the available evidence. The claim that the extended-release formulation meant the drug was unlikely to be abused was, from a pharmacological standpoint, dubious, since the extended-release mechanism could be easily defeated by crushing the tablet, and since the underlying molecule was still a highly potent opioid acting on the same receptors that had caused every previous opioid crisis. Purdue's sales force was trained to address physician concerns about addiction, with reassurances drawn from a single letter to the editor, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which had described low rates of addiction in hospital patients and had been extrapolated, with extraordinary creative license, into a general claim about OxyContin's safety. The medical community, which had in previous decades been criticized for undertreating pain, was newly receptive to messaging that suggested opioids could be prescribed more freely. The stage was set. The clinical context that allowed OxyContin to enter the market so successfully was itself the product of genuine medical concern. Pain had been systematically undertreated in American medicine for decades. Cancer patients dying in agony because their physicians were fearful of prescribing adequate opioids, post-surgical patients discharged with inadequate pain management, chronic pain sufferers turned away from practices where physicians had been told that opioid prescriptions were a regulatory liability. The pain management reform movement of the 1990s, which advocated for pain as the fifth vital sign and for more aggressive treatment of both acute and chronic pain, was responding to a real problem. The solution it arrived at, broad expansion of opioid prescribing, combined a genuine medical need with a pharmaceutical industry that had a product to sell and an army of sales representatives to sell it. Purdue's marketing operation for OxyContin was in certain respects unprecedented in scale and sophistication. The company identified the highest volume opioid prescribers in the country and targeted them with sales calls, speaker fees, all expenses paid medical education conferences, and a message that consistently minimized the risks of long-term opioid prescribing. The Speaker Bureau paid physicians to give talks about pain management that prominently featured OxyContin. The patient education materials downplayed dependency. Internal documents that emerged in subsequent litigation showed that Purdue was aware, earlier than their public statements acknowledged, that OxyContin was being misused at significant rates, and that the awareness had not prompted changes in marketing strategy. The prescribing rates for opioids tripled between 1991 and 2011. By 2012, physicians in the United States were prescribing enough opioid painkillers to supply every American adult with a month's supply simultaneously. The geographic distribution of those prescriptions was not random. It tracked rural communities. It tracked communities with high rates of work-related injury. It tracked communities where economic options had contracted and where a bottle of pills was, at certain doses and in certain circumstances, a temporary exit from pain that had no other exit available. The cycle that had begun with opium was running again, with new chemicals and new brand names, and it was running at a scale that made all previous American opioid crises look, by comparison, almost modest. The OxyContin epidemic did not happen by accident. It happened through deliberate decisions made by specific people with specific financial incentives, and the family at the center of those decisions was the Sacklers, who owned Purdue Pharma and who were, at the time, among the most prominent philanthropists in American culture. Their name appeared on museum wings, university buildings, and hospital galleries, while their company was engaged in what federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the most aggressive and deceptive prescription drug marketing campaigns in American history. Purdue paid doctors to speak at promotional events. It distributed misleading educational materials. It tracked prescribers and targeted those who prescribed the most, rewarding high-volume prescribers with additional attention from sales representatives. When internal data showed that OxyContin was being diverted and abused at significant rates, the information was managed rather than acted upon. The people in the boardroom, unlike the people in Kensington, would face few lasting consequences. The Sackler family's wealth derived almost entirely from the pharmaceutical industry. Arthur Sackler, the family patriarch, had pioneered pharmaceutical marketing practices in the 1950s and 60s that transformed the relationship between drug companies and prescribers, practices including direct sales calls on physicians, advertorial content in medical journals, and the use of paid physicians as marketing intermediaries that became standard industry practice. Arthur died in 1987 before OxyContin was launched, but the marketing architecture he had helped create was the infrastructure on which his brothers and nephew's company built its campaign. The Purdue Pharma story is meticulously documented in court records, in Patrick Radden Keefe's book Empire of Pain, and in the legal proceedings that eventually concluded with Purdue pleading guilty to federal criminal charges and the Sackler family agreeing to a civil settlement worth several $billions, a settlement that many observers, including states' attorneys general and families of people who had died from OxyContin-related overdoses, regarded as inadequate relative to the scale of the harm. The Sackler family members who ran Purdue during the OxyContin era did not face criminal prosecution. This outcome was not accidental. It was the product of a legal system in which the liability of a privately held corporation and the personal liability of its owners can be structurally separated in ways that the law permits, and that ordinary intuitions about accountability do not. The people who died were mostly not in boardrooms. They were in small towns in Appalachia, in former coal country, in rural communities across the South and Midwest, where economic devastation and the concentrated prescription of OxyContin had arrived in the same decade. They were in suburbs where pills had moved from medicine cabinets to social networks among teenagers. They were in cities where the progression from prescription opioids to heroin had followed the economic logic of the drug market. When OxyContin became expensive and harder to obtain, heroin was cheaper and more available. The geography of the overdose epidemic was a map of American inequality, with a pharmaceutical overlay, and the people whose names were on the museum wings did not live in it. When OxyContin's original formulation was eventually replaced in 2010 with an abuse-deterrent version that could not be easily crushed, something happened that policymakers and public health officials might have predicted but largely did not. A significant number of people who had been dependent on prescription opioids switched to heroin. The economics were straightforward. Heroin was cheaper, more available, and produced a similar effect. This transition, which occurred at scale across communities that had previously had minimal heroin use, dramatically expanded the geography of heroin addiction in America. The epidemic was no longer concentrated in urban centers and communities of color. It was spreading into white suburban and rural communities, which, in a dynamic that was immediately remarked upon by commentators of all political persuasions, was met with a markedly different policy response than previous heroin epidemics had received. The language shifted from criminal to medical. The television segment shifted from punitive to sympathetic. Historians will have much to say about this. The abuse-deterrent reformulation of OxyContin was itself a public health intervention. and it reduced OxyContin-specific abuse rates measurably. The problem was that it treated opioid dependence as a supply problem, removed the supply, the problem contracts, without addressing the underlying dependency that the years of prescription opioids had created. A person who had been physically dependent on OxyContin did not become not dependent when the reformulated pills appeared. They became dependent on a drug they could no longer obtain as easily, at a price they could no longer sustain, and in a community where heroin dealers had identified the market opportunity and filled it. The substitution was rapid, and its consequences were predictable to anyone who understood that opioid dependence is a physiological state that cannot be resolved by removing one supply source without offering an alternative. The heroin that these new users encountered was qualitatively different from what their bodies had been calibrated to. Prescription opioids come with known concentrations, predictable dosing, and pharmaceutical-grade purity. The heroin sold on the street in the early 2010s was variable in concentration, adulterated with unknown substances, and entirely without standardization. Someone who had been managing a prescription opioid habit at known doses was now estimating doses from an unlabeled product of unknown concentration purchased from someone with no professional obligation to their health. Overdose rates, which had been rising through the prescription opioid era, accelerated. The response that the white suburban demographic commanded was, in observable ways, more compassionate and more medically oriented than the response to previous heroin epidemics in communities of colour. Governors gave press conferences about addiction as a disease. Police departments in some communities adopted naloxone distribution and diversion programs that sent people to treatment rather than prison. The phrase public health crisis was used with regularity and with genuine feeling. The question of whether a different population having the same epidemic would have been met with the same response is one that the historical record invites, and that honest answers make uncomfortable. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid approximately 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine by weight, was developed in 1960 by the Belgian pharmacologist Paul Janssen and entered legitimate medical use as an anesthetic and pain management tool. Its medical applications are genuine. It is widely used in surgical settings, in palliative care, in pain management for cancer patients, and in epidurals. What fentanyl was not designed for, and what it is thoroughly unsuited to, is illicit distribution by dealers who are mixing it into heroin supplies without precise measuring equipment. Because at the concentrations involved, a dose that is 2 milligrams too large is the difference between high and dead. The introduction of illicitly manufactured fentanyl into the heroin supply, which began in earnest around 2013 and accelerated dramatically through 2015 and beyond, drove overdose death rates to levels that exceeded every previous peak in American drug history. The drug that replaced heroin as the primary driver of opioid deaths was more potent, cheaper to produce, and could be manufactured entirely without the poppy, rendering every previous supply disruption strategy essentially irrelevant. Illicitly manufactured fentanyl entered the American drug supply primarily through two channels: direct synthesis by Mexican cartels that had identified it as a more efficient product than heroin, and imports of fentanyl and its precursor chemicals from Chinese manufacturing operations. The economics were starkly favourable. Fentanyl required no agricultural land, no seasonal harvest, no complex precursor supply chain based on poppy cultivation. It could be synthesized in a laboratory from commercially available chemicals, transported in quantities small enough to make interdiction extremely difficult, and mixed into other drugs to increase their potency at costs far below what heroin-based opioids required. From a supply chain perspective, fentanyl was a more efficient product in almost every measurable way. The fact that it was also dramatically more lethal was, from the supply chain perspective, not a bug to be corrected. The mixing problem is worth dwelling on because it explains why fentanyl's introduction into the drug supply was so catastrophically lethal beyond anything that could have been predicted from its pharmacology alone. Fentanyl is active at microgram doses, quantities so small they are invisible to the naked eye, smaller than a grain of salt. When fentanyl is mixed into a larger quantity of powder intended to simulate heroin, the distribution of the fentanyl through the mixture is not uniform. A phenomenon called hot spotting means that one portion of what looks like a uniform powder may contain many times more fentanyl than the adjacent portion. The person who injects one bag may receive almost no fentanyl and notice no unusual effect. The person who injects the bag that contained most of the fentanyl may receive a dose 20 times what they expected and be dead before they can reach the phone. This is not a solvable problem with the tools available on a street corner. It is an inherent property of the chemistry of mixing, and it has killed tens of thousands of people who had no way of knowing what was in the drug they were using. Naloxone, sold under the brand name Narcan among others, is an opioid antagonist that can reverse an opioid overdose within minutes of administration by blocking the opioid receptors and displacing whatever drug is currently occupying them. It was developed in the 1960s, was approved for clinical use in 1971, and was widely available in emergency rooms for decades. What it was not, until harm reduction advocates and public health researchers pushed for it successfully in the late 1990s and 2000s, was widely available to the people most likely to witness an overdose, which is to say, other drug users, family members, and friends. The resistance to broad naloxone distribution was, in retrospect, a case study in how moral frameworks about drug use can interfere with straightforward public health logic. The objection most commonly raised was that making naloxone widely available would reduce the deterrent effects of overdose risk, thereby encouraging drug use. Research consistently failed to find evidence supporting this premise. Naloxone access reduced deaths. The premise did not survive contact with data, but it took years to fully lose its grip on policy. The harm reduction movement that fought for naloxone access was part of a broader philosophical reorientation in addiction public health that had its origins in the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. Activists and public health workers who were watching intravenous drug users die from HIV at catastrophic rates began organizing around the principle that reducing the harm associated with drug use through needle exchange, through safer use education, through naloxone, through testing strips, was a legitimate and urgent public health goal, independent of whether it also reduced drug use. The principle was controversial in ways that are, in retrospect, difficult to justify. The argument against harm reduction consistently prioritized symbolic messaging about drug use over the empirical question of whether people lived or died. Harm reduction was accused of enabling addiction. The response, which was correct and which data supported, was that the alternative was enabling death. The scale of naloxone distribution that eventually developed, through pharmacies, through community programs, through first responders, through distribution to families of people who use drugs, demonstrated something important about the tractability of overdose mortality. Overdose deaths are not an inevitable consequence of drug use. They are a consequence of specific circumstances. The concentration of the drug, the availability of reversal medication, the presence of someone to administer it, and the time elapsed between respiratory arrest and intervention. Each of these variables is addressable. Naloxone addresses one of them directly and at low cost. Programs that expanded naloxone access saved measurable numbers of lives, numbers large enough to be significant at the population level, and specific enough that individual families could name the person whose life had been saved. The expansion of naloxone access did not end the opioid crisis. Nothing so simple could do that, because the opioid crisis was not a simple problem, but it proved a principle, that reducing the harm associated with drug use was possible, that the tools to do it existed, and that the primary obstacle was not technical but political. A set of moral assumptions about what people who used drugs deserved that was resistant to evidence but not immune to it. Each year that naloxone distribution expanded, the death toll from overdose was lower than it would otherwise have been. This is what public health looks like when it's working. It is less dramatic than solving the problem entirely. It is also, on the scale of human lives, vastly more important. In the latter decades of the 20th century and accelerating sharply in the 21st, neuroscience began producing a picture of opioid addiction that bore very little resemblance to the moral failing framework that had dominated policy and public understanding for 100 years. Brain imaging studies showed that chronic opioid use produces measurable, lasting structural changes in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control and decision-making. The brain's dopamine system, which mediates motivation and reward, is fundamentally reorganized by prolonged opioid exposure in ways that make natural rewards feel flat and obtaining the drug feel compulsory rather than chosen. The concept of the hijacked reward system, where the drug has essentially reprogrammed the brain's motivational architecture to prioritize drug seeking above other survival behaviors, emerged from decades of basic neuroscience as the closest thing to a mechanistic explanation for why addiction is resistant to willpower alone. This did not immediately or fully translate into policy, but it changed the conversation in ways that were eventually meaningful. The dopamine system at the center of this story is, in its normal operation, one of the brain's most important motivational tools. Dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, a small structure deep in the brain's reward circuitry, signals the presence of something rewarding, directing attention and motivation toward obtaining it. Natural rewards, food, sex, social bonding, produce modest dopamine releases that motivate behavior without overwhelming the system. Opioids produce dopamine releases of a magnitude that dwarf natural rewards, training the brain with extraordinary efficiency to prioritize drug seeking. Over time, the brain adapts to these artificial floods by down-regulating its dopamine response, both to the drug and to natural rewards. The result is a brain in which the drug produces diminishing returns, while simultaneously being the primary source of the motivation signals that once drove all reward-seeking behavior. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented, reproducible pattern of neural adaptation that can be visualized in brain scans and measured in animal models. Buprenorphine, the medication that became central to modern opioid addiction treatment, arrived in clinical use in the early 2000s and represented the most significant pharmacological advance in addiction medicine since methadone. Unlike methadone, which required daily clinic attendance under strict supervision, buprenorphine could be prescribed by office-based physicians in standard clinical settings, a change enabled by the Drug Addiction Treatment Act of 2000, which represented the first federal legislative acknowledgement that opioid addiction could be treated as a medical condition in a normal medical setting. The drug's pharmacological profile made it safer than methadone. It was a partial agonist rather than a full agonist at opioid receptors, which meant it had a ceiling effect that reduced overdose risk. And its office-based availability made it accessible to patients who could not or would not attend a methadone clinic. The evidence base for buprenorphine treatment was and remains strong. Patients on buprenorphine maintenance have lower rates of heroin use, lower rates of mortality, and better overall function than patients not in treatment. The drug does not cure addiction any more than insulin cures diabetes. It manages a chronic condition in a way that allows the person with that condition to live their life. This is what effective medicine looks like for chronic disease, and in the 2 decades since buprenorphine became available, its expansion, still incomplete, still unequally distributed, still hampered by regulatory restrictions and stigma, has saved measurable lives. while the United States was engaged in a war on drugs that produced record incarceration numbers and relatively modest reductions in drug use, other countries were conducting natural experiments in alternative approaches that produced results worth noting. Switzerland, beginning in the 1990s, implemented a heroin-assisted treatment program in which severely dependent patients receive pharmaceutical-grade heroin under clinical supervision. The outcomes were striking. Crime rates among participants dropped sharply, health improved, social functioning increased, and deaths from overdose among the treated population were essentially eliminated. Portugal, in 2001, decriminalized personal possession of all drugs, including heroin, and redirected the resources previously spent on prosecution toward treatment, housing, and social support. Over the following decade, drug-related deaths fell, HIV infection rates among drug users fell, and drug use rates remained stable or declined. Neither country was claiming to have solved addiction. Both were demonstrating that the choice was not between punishment and permissiveness, but between approaches that produced better or worse outcomes for actual human beings. The Swiss heroin-assisted treatment program emerged from a specific crisis. In the late 1980s, Zurich's Platzspitz Park, known as Needle Park, had become an open-air drug market and injection site of extraordinary scale, with thousands of people injecting heroin daily in a public space that had become emblematic of a policy approach that was failing visibly and catastrophically. The Swiss government's decision to experiment with heroin prescription was driven not by ideology but by pragmatism. The existing approach was clearly not working, the human cost was obviously unacceptable, and the theoretical arguments against trying something different were less compelling than the bodies that were accumulating. The results of the Swiss program, published in peer-reviewed literature and replicated in follow-up studies, consistently showed that patients who received pharmaceutical heroin in a clinical setting were significantly more likely to reduce their criminal activity, maintain stable housing, and achieve improvements in health and social functioning than comparable patients receiving methadone or other standard treatments. The explanation was not mysterious. A patient who receives a known quantity of pharmaceutical-grade drug at regular intervals does not need to spend their days obtaining money through crime, does not need to inject unknown quantities of adulterated street drugs, and does not experience the constant cycle of withdrawal and emergency that organizes the days of someone managing an illegal dependency. The clinical setting also provided regular contact with healthcare workers and social services in ways that opened pathways to housing, employment, and a C for patients who eventually wanted to taper off opioids, conventional treatment. Portugal's decriminalisation was a different intervention with different mechanisms and similarly instructive results. The Portuguese model did not legalise drugs. It removed criminal penalties for personal possession while maintaining them for supply and distribution. Quantities of drugs found on a person were presumed to be for personal use up to a specified threshold, and people found with personal use quantities were referred to dissuasion commissions, panels that could recommend treatment, social support, community service, or no intervention depending on the circumstances. The legal change alone did not produce the outcomes. It was the investment in treatment and social support infrastructure that accompanied it, funded by resources that had previously been spent on prosecution and imprisonment. The lesson was not that decriminalisation alone was the answer. The lesson was that treating drug use as a health problem required building the health infrastructure to address it, and that the resources existed if the political choices were different. Somewhere in the process of recognizing the catastrophic misuse of OxyContin and the broader prescription opioid epidemic, American medicine overcorrected in ways that created their own serious problems. physicians who had been prescribing opioids freely under pressure from patient satisfaction metrics and pharmaceutical marketing began pulling back sharply, in many cases abruptly discontinuing prescriptions for patients who had been stable on them for years. Patients with genuine severe chronic pain, cancer patients, patients with serious degenerative conditions, patients who'd been managing their pain successfully with carefully titrated opioids under medical supervision, found themselves unable to obtain treatment they had come to depend on. The stigma of opioid prescribing spread from the abusers of the system to the entire system, in a pendulum swing that proved once again that opioid policy in America has significant difficulty finding the center of the road. Pain medicine became, and in many practices remains, a field defined by anxiety. The anxiety of undertreating real suffering, and the anxiety of contributing to a crisis that has already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The CDC opioid prescribing guidelines published in 2016 were intended as guidance for primary care physicians managing chronic pain, a set of recommendations intended to encourage more cautious prescribing without removing clinical judgment from the equation. What happened in practice was that the guidelines were interpreted by many practitioners, insurers, and state regulators as hard limits, and patients whose stable, effective pain management regimens exceeded the guideline thresholds found their prescriptions cut, declined, or terminated. The CDC subsequently clarified, repeatedly and explicitly, that the guidelines were not intended as mandatory limits and should not be applied rigidly without clinical judgment. The clarifications had limited effect on institutional practice that had already reorganized itself around the numbers. The patients who were left in pain, and there were many, documented in medical literature and in journalistic accounts, and in the testimonies that accumulated in online communities of people with chronic pain, represented a genuine medical failure, alongside the prescribing excess that had preceded it. The person with severe degenerative joint disease who had been managing their pain with opioids for a decade and was then abruptly tapered off over 30 days was not a safer person. They were a person in more pain with fewer options. Some turned to the black market for the opioids their physicians would no longer prescribe. Some obtained heroin. Some died from suicide in circumstances that were directly attributed to the sudden removal of pain management. The accounting of harm requires counting these people too. The modern landscape of opioid pain management is one in which the pendulum has swung from recklessness to restriction, and has not yet found a stable point between them. The patients in most need, people with complex, severe, treatment-resistant chronic pain, navigate a system in which every prescription carries regulatory scrutiny, every physician carries liability anxiety, and the patient's reported experience of pain, which is by definition subjective and unverifiable, is viewed with a skepticism that would be considered unacceptable if applied to any other symptom of any other condition. Morphine still works. It still relieves suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. The challenge of using it responsibly has not gotten simpler in 200 years of trying. You stand at the end of 200 years of opioid history and attempt to draw up the ledger, and what you find is not a story of evil versus good or ignorance versus knowledge, though there are elements of both. What you find is a story about a class of compounds that are simultaneously among the most effective pain-relieving substances ever discovered and among the most reliably addictive, and about a civilization that has never quite managed to hold both of those facts in mind at the same time. Every generation has made the same basic error. It has seen the power of opioids to relieve suffering, underestimated the power of those same drugs to reorganize the brain, and repeated the confidence of the previous generation with a different molecule and a new brand name. Morphine was the cure for opium addiction. Heroin was the cure for morphine addiction. OxyContin was the cure for the undertreated pain that had been left by too much caution about morphine. Fentanyl arrived without being invited by anyone. At some point in this chain of events, optimism stopped looking like a virtue and started looking like a pattern. The same pattern, cycling through the same stages, leaving the same kind of wreckage in the same kinds of communities, and arriving each time with complete confidence that this time was different. The overdose death toll in the United States over the past 25 years exceeds 500,000 people, a number that surpasses American casualties in World War II. The majority of those deaths occurred in the last decade as fentanyl reshaped the drug supply in ways that made the previous phase of the epidemic look, by comparison, manageable. The deaths are not evenly distributed. They concentrate in communities where economic precarity, limited healthcare access, and histories of trauma converge, which is not a coincidence but a consequence. The geography of opioid death is a map of the places American public investment has most consistently failed to reach, overlaid with the routes of pharmaceutical distribution and drug trafficking that reach those same places with reliable efficiency. The scientific understanding of opioid dependence is, in 2026, substantially more sophisticated than it was in any previous period. The neurobiology is well characterized. The effective medications are known: methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone. The treatment approaches that produce the best outcomes. Comprehensive care that addresses housing, mental health, trauma history, and social connection alongside pharmacology are well documented. The harm reduction tools that save lives in the meantime, naloxone, fentanyl test strips, safe injection facilities in the jurisdictions that have implemented them, are available and effective. The gap between what is known and what is implemented remains, in the United States specifically, vast and lethal. That gap is not primarily a scientific problem. It is a political, economic, and moral problem, a collective failure to distribute the fruits of understanding to the people who need them most. The poppy is still growing somewhere tonight. The molecule that certain are extracted from it 200 years ago is still, in controlled settings, one of the most effective pain medications available to human medicine. The version of it that Bayer named heroically and sold with confidence to children is still being manufactured in illicit laboratories in quantities that have never been higher and distributed in forms that have never been more lethal. The patients who need opioids for genuine pain are still navigating a system shaped by the consequences of the patients who were given opioids they didn't need. And somewhere in an emergency room tonight, a paramedic is administering naloxone to someone whose breathing has stopped, and the naloxone is working, and the breathing is resuming, and the person is waking up confused and alive, and the question of what happens next, whether they receive treatment, whether treatment is available, whether it is paid for, whether it addresses the conditions that made the drug compelling in the first place, remains, as it has remained for 200 years, the most important question in the room, and the one that the room is least reliably equipped to answer. Here is the part where we briefly pause to explain, without judgment, why heroin is pharmacologically more intense than morphine. Because understanding this is understanding why the entire medical catastrophe that followed was both predictable and somehow completely unanticipated by everyone involved. When morphine is injected or swallowed, it crosses into the brain relatively slowly, because the brain has a protective mechanism called the blood-brain barrier that tries to limit what chemicals get through. Heroin, being diacetyl morphine, is more fat-soluble than morphine, which means it passes through that barrier much more rapidly. Once inside the brain, it converts back into morphine, but the speed of delivery is everything. The faster an opioid hits the brain's receptors, the more intensely euphoric the effect, and the more powerfully it imprints itself on the brain's reward circuitry. Morphine is a key that fits the lock. Heroin is the same key, but it gets there running instead of walking, and the brain notices the difference in ways that matter enormously when you're trying to understand why people find it so difficult to stop. The opioid receptors that morphine and heroin act on, predominantly the mu-opioid receptors, scattered through the brain and spinal cord, are part of the body's own endogenous pain management and reward system. The brain produces its own opioid-like molecules called endorphins and enkephalins, which bind to these same receptors and produce the natural feelings of comfort, reduced pain, and mild euphoria associated with activities like vigorous exercise, eating, or social bonding. Morphine and heroin work by mimicking these natural molecules at a scale that the brain's own chemistry cannot match. When you inject heroin, you're flooding a system designed for endorphin-level inputs with a molecular signal many times more powerful than anything the brain expects to receive through normal experience. It is, in the most literal neurochemical sense, a conversation the brain has never had before, conducted at a volume that drowns everything else out. The brain responds to this in the way that any sensible system responds to being overwhelmed. It adapts. Over time, with repeated exposure to opioids, the brain downregulates its own receptor sensitivity, reducing the number and responsiveness of mu-opioid receptors in what amounts to a defensive recalibration. The result is that the same dose produces a weaker effect. More drug is required to achieve the original sensation. This is tolerance, and it is not a moral failing. It is biology doing exactly what biology does when a system is consistently overstimulated. Tolerance develops faster with heroin than with morphine, because heroin delivers its molecular signal faster, producing more pronounced peaks that trigger more aggressive adaptive responses. Alongside tolerance develops physical dependence, the state in which the brain has so thoroughly recalibrated itself around the presence of the drug that its absence produces a physiological crisis. Opioid withdrawal, in someone who's been using heavily, is not simply uncomfortable. It involves diarrhea, vomiting, severe muscle cramps, profound insomnia, sweating, shaking, an overwhelming and physical sense of dread and misery that is partly the nervous system, stripped of its opioid cushioning, firing at full sensitivity. People in opioid withdrawal describe it as a feeling that their skin is simultaneously crawling off their body and too tight to contain them. This is not metaphor. It is the experience of a nervous system that has been chemically altered, operating without the chemical it has organized itself around. Understanding this does not make every choice that follows inevitable. It does make the choices considerably more comprehensible. And it makes the confidence of the people who sold diacetyl morphine as non-addictive either a failure of imagination or a failure of honesty. Two possibilities that the historical record has not fully resolved and probably never will. Outro. And so here you are. You made it through 200 years of the most confidently wrong medicine in human history. 200 years of brilliant chemists isolating things, ambitious companies naming these things heroically, and exhausted human beings receiving those things through a needle or a bottle or a child's cough syrup, while everyone in a position of authority assured them it was fine. It was not, as you now know, fine. It was almost never fine. And yet the story kept going, and people kept trying, and somewhere in the wreckage of every failed solution was a genuine impulse to stop pain, to ease suffering, to give a person back the part of their life that hurt too much to live in. That impulse was not wrong. The execution was catastrophic. The distinction matters. Tonight you travelled a long road, and it is worth pausing at the end of it to notice where that road actually went. It began in a poppy field somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia. In a world where the only thing anyone knew about opium was that it worked, that it softened the sharpest edges of a life that was, for most people in most of history, considerably harder than anything you've been asked to manage today. The farmers who cultivated it were not naive. They knew it had power. They did not know what kind, or how much, or what the bill would eventually come to. They were working with the information available to them, in the conditions available to them, and the best they could do was observe that the plant helped and hope that helping was enough. Then came Sir Turner, young and methodical and almost certainly underpaid, in a small pharmacy in a German city, extracting a white powder from that ancient resin and giving it a name that honoured sleep and would eventually honour something considerably darker. He was 21 years old. He tested it on himself because there was no other way to test it. He found what he was looking for and reported it honestly. The tragedy that followed was not his fault. It was also not an accident. It was what happens when a substance of extraordinary power is released into a world that does not yet have the vocabulary, the regulatory framework, or the pharmacological understanding to manage it responsibly. Then came the needles, then came the war, then came the soldier coming home with a bag of pills and no one to tell him what would happen next. Then came the Victorian mother with the laudanum bottle on the nightstand and the doctor who prescribed it for her nerves, and the culture that called her fragile rather than dependent, and the system that offered her no pathway out. Then came Bayer, confident and commercially motivated, with a new product and a heroic name and a study that lasted 4 weeks, and a claim that would be repeated and then retracted, and then repeated again, a century later, with different molecules and different brand names and the same fundamental miscalculation about what opioids do to human brains over time. Every person in this story, the patients, the physicians, the chemists, the reformers, the legislators, the dealers, the families, was operating inside a set of constraints they did not fully choose and could not fully see. That is the condition of being a person in history. You work with what you have. You know what your era knows. You make the mistakes your era makes, and occasionally, if you're lucky or stubborn or both, you correct them in time to matter. The correction has been slow. The cost of the slowness has been paid in lives by people who deserved better. What the history of morphine and heroin teaches, if you are willing to let it teach you rather than simply disturb you and leave, is something about the relationship between certainty and harm. The people who caused the most damage in this story were not the ones who admitted uncertainty. They were the ones who were most certain that heroin was not addictive, certain that criminalization would solve the problem, certain that a new molecule was different from all the previous molecules, certain that patients reporting pain were exaggerating and patients reporting addiction were weak. The certainty was the problem. The knowledge was always partial, always catching up to the reality, always a few years behind the bodies that were accumulating while the experts debated what was actually happening. The people who caused the least harm, and sometimes the most good, were the ones who acknowledged what they did not know and tried anyway. The harm reduction workers who distributed naloxone in communities where the official response was still debating whether doing so sent the wrong message. The clinicians who prescribed methadone to patients that everyone else had given up on and watched those patients get their lives back. The researchers who followed the Vietnam veterans home and found a result that contradicted everything the conventional model predicted and published it anyway. The Swiss public health officials who looked at Needle Park and decided that ideological consistency was a less compelling value than keeping people alive. These were not perfect people or perfect solutions. They were people who looked at what was actually happening, set aside the framework that wasn't working, and tried something else. That willingness to look at what is actually happening and respond to it rather than to what you believe should be happening, is, it turns out, one of the rarer qualities in public health. It is rarer still in politics. It is not rare at all in the people who have lived this history from the inside, the people who have been dependent on these drugs and have found their way to stability, the people who have lost family members to overdoses and turned their grief into advocacy, the people who work in emergency rooms and treatment clinics and harm reduction programs, and know exactly what the gap between knowledge and policy costs, because they see it every shift. Those people deserve your attention. They have been carrying a weight that the rest of the culture mostly prefers not to look at directly, because looking at it directly requires acknowledging that addiction is not a failure of character in the people who experience it, but a failure of systems in the societies that shape the conditions in which it flourishes. That is a more uncomfortable conclusion than the alternative. It is also the one the evidence supports. So tonight, as you settle into your bed in a world that has indoor plumbing and clean water, and medications that are at least tested before they are sold, mostly, and a regulatory apparatus that is imperfect but present, consider the distance between where you are and where this story began. Consider the people who navigated that distance without maps, without adequate medicine, without the social infrastructure that might have caught them before they fell. Consider the veterans who came home from wars and found a bottle of pills waiting for them instead of a system prepared to treat what the war had done to them. Consider the women who were given laudanum for the pain of lives that offered them no other exit, and who were then judged for the dependence that the laudanum produced. Consider the people in small towns and large cities who are prescribed OxyContin by physicians who had been told it was safe, and who discovered, years into a dependency they had not chosen, that the assurance had been a lie told at scale for profit. Consider what it would mean to live in a world that met that level of suffering with the full weight of what is now known, that addiction is a medical condition, that effective treatments exist, that the environment surrounding drug use shapes its trajectory as powerfully as the pharmacology of the drug itself, that people in the grip of opioid dependence are not moral failures requiring punishment, but human beings requiring medicine and support and the conditions that make recovery possible. That world does not fully exist yet. Parts of it do. The parts that exist were built by people who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they were. People who were not always powerful, not always credentialed, not always listened to in real time, but who were, in the long run, right. Being right in the long run is cold comfort when you're watching someone die in the short run. But it is what the historical record offers, evidence that things have changed before, slowly and at great cost, and that they can change again. The poppy is still growing, the molecule is still potent, the brain is still what it is, a remarkable, fragile, adaptive organ that did not evolve to encounter diacetyl morphine and that responds to it in ways that are predictable, understandable, and not the fault of the person whose brain it is. The 200 years of catastrophe that followed the first extraction of morphine from that ancient resin were not inevitable. They were the product of choices about regulation, about research, about who deserved treatment and who deserved punishment, about what counted as a public health crisis and what counted as a private moral failure. Those choices were made by specific people in specific institutions at specific moments, and they could, at most of those moments, have been made differently. That is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for the very specific kind of hope that history sometimes offers. Not the hope that things will automatically improve, but the hope that improvement is possible, that it has happened before, and that the people who made it happen were ordinary people who simply refused, at a moment that mattered, to accept the acceptable losses that everyone around them had already stopped questioning. Tonight, as your breath slows and the room goes quiet, you are the descendant of every person in this story. The ones who survived and the ones who did not. The ones who were helped and the ones who were failed. The ones who made decisions in boardrooms and the ones who lived with the consequences of those decisions in bodies that had not been consulted. They're all behind you in the long human procession that carries the past forward into the present, whether the present wants it or not. The least you can do, and perhaps the most, is remember that they were there. Rest now. The history will still be there in the morning. So will you, which is the only thing that matters at this particular hour. Good night.